Please join me in welcoming Amanda.
Thank you very much, Susan. Just before we start, I'd like just to read through the quote, if you would. Setting aside the pejorative language for a minute, what stuns me most about this quote was it was written in 1937, and I think it really captures existing debates against conservative trends in education that we're having now, and also this continued contention about the purposes of schooling. So I think it's a really interesting and good quote to begin with given the transformative understandings of schooling that we would all have here. So today I'm going to talk about a school from my research in a book that's fairly recently been published. But I thought I would share with you a story before we start. I actually woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning this morning. I couldn't get back to sleep because I had Jenny's question from yesterday's session in my head about critical moments in my life that have shaped my feminism. So I thought I'd share with you. You know, there's been some personal moments, such as a time in Year 10 where I couldn't find my school uniform bathers, and they were found in the boys' toilet with the crutch cut out of them. Oh. Another time I thought was shaping me as a feminist was when I went on my first diet at 10, because I felt like I was fat, which ended up into an eating disorder at the age of 16 when I weighed 38 kilos. And a lifetime of problems with weight and eating. That's another moment. Or at others has been the dumb blonde stereotype, which I've had all through my career, where even my honours thesis and my PhD, there were rumours that they were written by my male partners at the time. But they're personal matters that have raged me and shaped my feminism. But I was thinking about the speakers that we've had at this conference, and on a more positive note, they've all had something to contribute to my journey as a feminist, and I'm so honoured and humbled to be here in the company of these amazing giants of feminism. But I just wanted to, I hope it's not self-indulgent, but I just wanted to very quickly run through some of the key things that these feminists have shared on my journey. The first one, Dale Spender, I often shared her parts of her book, Man-Made Language, in a lecture. One of the key things that I remember was that the study that she cites, which suggests that there's over 220 words for slut, or a disparaging word for females in the dictionary, where there's only 10 or 20 for comparable for men, and they're all positive, like stud. So that's Dale's work. Robin Davies has been very influential, particularly her Shards of Glass book and Body of Writing, which were a very formative part of my PhD work. And I love her quote. I use it a lot. We can only ever be what the various discourses make possible. Raymond's work clearly similarly influential in terms of my PhD, and her book on masculinities and the men and the boys. Jane Kenway and Jill Blackmore's work with others in Answering Back in 1998, and The Emotional Dimensions of Feminist Pedagogy, another key text that shaped my work. And also your paper, Masculinities Under Siege, On the Defensive and Under Construction, and a quote in your work that said, "Boys is a new disadvantage, they're strutting and fretting at the centre of the gender reform stage." I love that. Julie McLeod, Jerry Collins, Jane Kenway's amazing report about factors influencing the educational performance of males and females in schools and their initial destinations after leaving schools. A very long title. It contributed enormously to the which boys, which girls debate. And the following AER paper, Gender Debates, Maria Pilotto-Chiaroli's work and Wayne Martino's work, amazingly influential, particularly being normal is the only way to be, and so what's a boy? And Lynn Yates, The Education of Girls and Policy Research. I mention these because I think we need to revisit sometimes some of these works, because we can only know where we are from where we've been, and sometimes we forget the significance of where we've been. So thank you for Obidian to those people. So just an overview of what I'm going to do today. There's a study upon which the book is based that I'd like to explore with you a little bit. I draw a lot on Nancy Fraser's work, her understandings of equity and justice, and her notions of parity of participation, and the three dimensions in the model of justice that she presents. Then I'll explore a little bit of the practical illumination of these strategies. And the school that I'm going to concentrate on is called Lavender High School, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a minute. So what I was interested in doing in the study was really foregrounding productive ways that schools were engaging with marginalised learners and supporting those marginalised learners. There were three schools. The first two are fairly atypical. First one, Lavender High School, is a school for Indigenous girls in suburban Queensland. Second one's an ESL, Intensive English Language Learning College, that supports students to go into mainstream high school. And the final primary school is a more mainstream school with about, I think, 70% white, Anglo, and the rest refugee immigrant cohort. So the marginalised learners that I was focusing on were Indigenous, refugee, immigrant, some Muslim girls and boys. So it was a very broad range of diversity and marginality that I was focusing on. And the schools that I went to were renowned for supporting these learners, so they were already had a strong reputation in that regard, so that's how I chose them. So that really shaped how I went into the schools, and that really shaped how I focused the research. So I spoke to leaders at the school that were doing work in the area of equity. I spoke to the students who were involved in programs that were targeting equity. So it was a very targeted approach, very qualitative, very case study approach. The progressive view of schooling that I drew on engaged with scholars like Mayo and Giroux. Certainly an emancipatory vision of education was what I was concentrating on. So the educators that I was talking to were certainly engaging with the space of schooling as a site of resistance for realising the goals of social justice. They realised the political nature of education, the importance of linking education to social change and connecting learning to the experiences and histories that students bring to the classroom. So this is the sort of educator that certainly resonated with those that I was interviewing. So as I said before, I really engaged with Nancy Fraser's work in this book. I found it useful in capturing the broad scope and multidimensionality of justice claims. She actually engages what she describes as a feminist non-identitarian politics, which is about really recognising the multifaceted nature of oppressions rather than a particular singular feminist politics. So I found that very generative in terms of how I was looking at how equity was approached in terms of diversity and not just one identity group. Her notion of parity of participation is a principle of equity that underlies her framework of what constitutes equity. So she says justice requires social arrangements that permit all to participate as peers in social life. So overcoming injustice for her means dismantling institutionalised obstacles that prevent some people from participating on par with others as full partners in social interaction. And this actually resonated with a lot of the ways in which the educators spoke about equity. So for example, this is Miss H from Lavender. She says, equity doesn't mean treating all of the kids the same. It's an expectation that their background and everything about their past life doesn't equal being a barrier. You know, everyone's job is to remove those barriers. There's a full range of abilities and so on. But what we would be against is having any of those barriers prevent them being all they can be. So, what are the barriers? Well, Nancy Fraser's work again came to the fore in terms of how I was looking at each of the schools I was going into and what the questions I was asking of the schools. So, of course, the three barriers you're probably quite familiar with: economic, cultural and political. So I'll just go through each of them. As Jill was explaining yesterday, economic obviously is one of the probably most typical ones that you would think of. It's about distributive justice, distributing material resources to those in low socioeconomic situations. The Gonski reforms are a key sort of platform for a distributive, as a distributive approach to justice, a redistributive approach. For me, it was also about the equitable distribution, hard to say, of the outcomes or the products of schooling. So, you know, education determines employment credentialing. It determines what students are able to do beyond school. So success at school is a very important measure and outcome of redistributive justice. Cultural recognition is the second of Nancy Fraser's dimensions, and this is about recognising and valuing marginalised and trivialised cultures. We see these in schools a lot. Cultural celebrations, critical pedagogies, intercultural awareness through the curriculum. That's actually part of the national curriculum, although I'm a little bit concerned with Kevin Donnelly's assertion that it's a vague postmodern idea. So, you know, this is a worry. But we are familiar with those strategies of cultural recognition in schools. And the last one, political representation, as Jill again was saying yesterday, it's about according all a voice. So it might involve more minority representation in terms of staff on school staff and process of supporting school student autonomy in schools. So I think we're all familiar with these strategies, but what Fraser's framework does is it allows us to step back and provide a comprehensive analytical frame from which to actually see what's going on in schools and ask these questions. So the school that I want to concentrate on today is Lavender High School, as I mentioned before. It was set up by an Indigenous activist in 1997, and it started off as a school in a 3-bedroom house with 7 students to support disadvantaged students, a lot of them identifying as Indigenous. And it grew to by 2007, I think, to 101 students in a regular, I guess you could call it, school building. So it had got enough funding to actually support 110 students. The girls are aged between 12 and 28. So it caters to girls older than would usually be the case. The issues of equity at this school obviously reflect the broader situation in Australia in terms of Indigenous disadvantage. As we all know, indigeneity and poverty are the greatest predictors of educational disadvantage that you can have. At this school, though, they were also dealing with the gender dimensions of Indigenous disadvantage: early pregnancy, sexual abuse, drug abuse, which is not necessarily gendered, homelessness, foster care, a lack of self-esteem and confidence. And the principal actually said that for some of these girls, this was their last chance at a proper education. Many had been expelled from mainstream schools, so it really was their last chance, I guess, in some ways. The principal described Lavender as a hard school. She said, for a teacher to front up the next day after someone's told them to F off, that's hard for anyone. We all feel a little abused if someone confronts you and tells you, I had a girl the other day say to me she hoped I'd die and she would not come to my funeral, and the next day she wrote me a beautiful poem. It's that sort of thing. Now, if I'd really taken that on board and believed her, I would be questioning whether I should be here. So you've got to detach from that. And you've got to say tomorrow's another day. And she was totally different the next day, and you could tell she really wished she hadn't said that, I got the chance to speak to one of a previous student who is now a youth worker at the school. Hers was a fairly typical story of the sorts of girls that were at the school. So she's 28 years old, and she got her senior certificate at Lavender at 26. She grew up in Brisbane, and in her words, she was in and out of foster care for about 12 years. She dropped out of school in grade 10. At the age of 18, she moved to Townsville just to commence a relationship with an Indigenous man. She had 4 children, but it was a difficult and abusive relationship, so she fled that relationship and came back to Brisbane and came across the school. Her argument for coming back to Brisbane was to support her children to have a better lifestyle. So you can see in terms of Fraser's framework that she's suffering those dimensions, on all dimensions, in terms of economic marginalisation, gender marginalisation, racial, cultural marginalisation. She doesn't have a voice as well. So one of the most important things at this school was its holistic approach to the girls. And a key element here is economic support. So redistributive justice was a key focus, and this was evident in many areas that were crucial to the girls' attendance and achievement. There was a liaison support role that this woman, Miss G, played, and often she would actually collect the kids and take them to school and things like that. But anyway, she says, well, my role within the school is to make sure that all the girls' needs are met, not so much about learning needs, but it's about other needs, health, food, mental health, accommodation. If the girls are suffering with domestic violence or sexual abuse, I refer them to the appropriate agencies, follow things up, make sure they're linked to people who can help them. So it's responding on a daily basis. There's a lot of things that need to happen sometimes before they can participate in the classroom. And I think that's true of a lot of disadvantaged students. And there was actually a creche at this school as well, for some of the girls' siblings and their children, and transport and financial services to get them to and from school and even court appearances that they had to attend. So as I said before, economic redistribution is also about redistributing the social goods from schooling, the economic and social goods from schooling. So it was really important that the girls were able to achieve on the same measuring sticks as their more privileged counterparts, i.e. obviously tests, so they can mix it with anybody and eventually access society in the same way as any other student would. Obviously, given that, as I said before, education determines employment credentialing. And this is a point that Chris Sarah makes quite well. He also makes the point to problematise or question culturally responsive schooling that waters down the curriculum or creates separate measures of achievement for students in terms of educational and social disadvantage. He would argue that high expectations, of course, are what's really important. But of course there are key tensions in terms of redistributive justice, and they're sort of about how do you accommodate backgrounds without falling into deficit understandings. So creating a balance between high expectations and intensive support is difficult. How do you acknowledge and accommodate these circumstances without falling into lowered expectations? Obviously the intensive, holistic, broader social support structures are really important, but one of the things that was really evident at this school was the notion of critical care, and that I came across in the US literature. So it was really about support and care combined with persistent and ongoing demands of academic achievements were challenging those deficit constructions of marginalised students that reinscribe disadvantage. And this was really obvious with one of Emma's comments. So I thought that was an interesting or a good illumination of that critical care notion. So cultural recognition at the school obviously was very, very important, and these are familiar strategies that we're certainly aware of. So they recognised, of course, Reconciliation Week, NAIDOC. They supported students to participate in the Death in Custody March, and one of the girls actually did a speech at that day. They commemorated Sorry Day. That was a huge event at the school where they invited elders to come in and talk about their experience of the stolen generation. They had cultural camps, and where, according to one of the girls, they learnt the traditional ways of Indigenous culture, and they had an Indigenous dance troupe. Now, these, as I said before, are familiar strategies, and they can be tokenistic, and I will actually explore that a little bit in a minute, but they were extremely important at this school because I think there's an assumption out there that just because someone's Indigenous, they automatically know about their heritage, whatever that might be. So for the girls at the school, they really appreciated and valued this cultural recognition. For Sarah, it was important, and she was a former student as well, and a youth worker. She described herself as a assimilated Aboriginal and coming from an assimilated Indigenous family. And she said, Mum didn't teach me anything. She didn't teach us anything traditional and stuff, so I was really confused growing up. That's how my mum raised us, and that's how she was raised. Yeah, it was the way they handled the grief and the trauma from assimilation. Let's not acknowledge it at all. So for her, assimilation meant a rejection of her history, and she found it quite culturally, for her, liberating and empowering to learn about that at school. But of course there are tensions and problematics, as you would be aware, of strategies of cultural recognition, especially in relation to celebrating cultural days. McConaughey, I love her work. She asks a really important question here. She asks, when is it useful to use the notion of Indigenous culture and Aboriginality, and when do these terms cease to become useful and instead work to limit, exclude and contain the possibilities that Indigenous people have for attaining institutional, disciplinary and political capacity? So I think we must recognise cultural recognition as an important organising principle in struggles for justice, as Bell Hooks would say, but it can undermine justice through reifying cultural difference as other. There's a tendency to reduce Indigenous people to their indigeneity and their culture. So she says sometimes it's important to focus on cultural distinctiveness through, for example, those cultural recognition strategies, but sometimes it will be important to dismantle cultural distinctiveness. And there's a few strategies at the school that I thought were really, really good at doing this. I don't have time to go into all of them, but there was family tree work and women's business forums where the girls would explore some of the issues that they were concerned with. And it was in a culturally, I guess, appropriate space with the elders leading these groups. But what I want to focus on today is the Poetry, Prose and Art book as a generative pedagogy of recognition that really supports a multi-dimensional understanding of Indigenous girls. And this book was compiled by the students, and as it was an outlet for the girls to explore and share their thoughts and emotions about particular issues in their life. So it was a useful tool to support the girls to understand and deal with some of the issues they were grappling with. There's obviously a strong tradition of autobiographical writing in the feminist literature to explore issues of identity along these lines. And this was a sort of a pedagogy for sharing and healing and self-reflection. And again, McConaughey's work was really useful here. She talks about pedagogies that can bear the weight of difficult knowledges. And I thought this pedagogy could do so and was appropriate to the circumstances that the girls were dealing with. And I'd like to share with you a few of the poems that the girls shared. And it was actually a commercially produced book that the girls had obviously, it was anonymised, the girls had obviously given their consent, but it was very, very difficult for me to read because some of the stories were about sexual abuse and were really difficult. But they were all in addition, there were stories of hope as well, but I'd just like to share with you a few of the stories. For Sarah, actually, she said, our stories need to be told. That was what she thought the purpose of the book was about. These are just from these two different girls. So when I found out I was pregnant, I was so sad and very scared. I didn't want to have this baby. I didn't think I was ready to be a mum. All I could do was cry. Then all I could do was be angry at my partner. I screamed and yelled abuse at him. And there's another one. She was haunted by her past, the yelling and the beatings. She used to lie awake and hear her mother screaming. She decided to end it all with a knife across her wrist. Across her wrist, I wonder if things would be different if she knew she would be missed. Now, when reading these, you know, there needs to be obviously those holistic, broader social support structures at the school to support some of these girls through these very difficult and or illegal, you know what I mean? So I'm not saying these pedagogies work without that broader framework of support, but I do think that they can create a space for exploring these issues, and they did for these girls. But there are also positive stories of joy. My future is so bright now, it's almost blinding. Now all my tears are happy ones, and I soar through the heavens, nothing will stop me now. Wake up and realise, get out and live your life. Strive to be the person that you see in your dreams. Connect the dots in your life, make it strong at the seams. Build positively into your armour to protect yourself from the sword of negativity. Respect yourself and create your own liberty. So I think the book illustrates a productive approach to recognising Indigenous culture, but one importantly that doesn't delimit the girls to their indigeneity, that recognises the broad multiplicities in their life that make up their identities as bright, gorgeous, positive young women. So the last dimension that Fraser talks about that was useful to theorise some of the things that were going on in this school is political representation. So the school sought out Indigenous staff. About 1/3 of the staff were Indigenous. Many of those were youth workers. There was a few Indigenous teachers. The youth workers played a really important liaison role for bridging the gap between school and the community. These workers would work beyond the school hours to build relationships with the students, especially, as I said before, supporting school attendance. And there was a policy that at least half of the board members would be Indigenous. So there are concerns more broadly with the underrepresentation of Indigenous teachers in Australian schools. I think it's less than 1%, and how this might be a contributing factor to the poor performance of Indigenous students and their low levels of retention in comparison to their non-Indigenous counterparts. And there's certainly arguments in favour of increasing the number of Indigenous teachers to create greater connectedness to Indigenous students and Indigenous issues. And this was, as I said, very important at this school. As the principal said, hate going to programs where it's all about Indigenous people, but there's not one Indigenous person there. And I think, hang on a minute, where are the Indigenous people that we're talking about here? I've actually walked out of places where I felt that money was being used by white people to advance supposedly Indigenous causes, when in actual fact that's just advancing their own cause, and people find that very confronting because they're all on this bandwagon, getting things happening for Indigenous people, but that's what we, white people, have done all our lives, made decisions for them. I mean, it's just crazy. So in these comments, the contentions of white-driven advocacy on behalf of Indigenous people are acknowledged. Such advocacy, of course, can be well-meaning and intentioned, but obviously not consulting Indigenous people silences and reinscribes inequity. And obviously such advocacy can be ethnocentric, imperialist, paternalistic, purporting to know what's best for Indigenous people. And that's very well recognised in the literature. Literature, that's not a word. And certainly my positionality in the research was an issue I needed to explore and be self-reflexive about, and I do write a little bit about that, or quite a lot, and angst a lot over it. And that illuminates the tensions and problematics here. Doesn't mean that white people shouldn't advocate, of course, with Indigenous people, and Catherine McConaughey makes another important point. She says we should resist the fashion to prescribe that only Indigenous people can know and speak about Indigenous issues. The links between racialised identity, knowledge and legitimacy can no longer be sustained within imperialist or anti-imperialist projects. So of course such representation tends to assume that only Indigenous people can legitimately speak about Indigenous issues, and that there is one Indigenous authentic voice. It restricts who can know and speak about issues of marginality and ignores the productive and important role that members of privileged groups must play to support marginalised groups. It also places undue expectation and responsibility on the members of marginalised groups to authentically represent and act on behalf of the interests of their group. So political representation must recognise the imperative of Indigenous representation in struggles for justice, but also how such representation may undermine justice through excluding those who can know and speak about Indigenous issues. The key here, of course, is a collaborative, ongoing, reflexive approach where Indigenous and non-Indigenous people work together in critical ways that focus on overcoming oppression. And a huge part of this, obviously, is decentering white privilege, including my own when I was doing this research. So, wrapping up.
We're subtle, Amanda.
No, as a Greek. The bird thing.
Extra half an hour.
So I guess really there's no one right way to educate for diversity and social justice. One of the things that was really salient in this research was, and in every research I do, is that you go into schools and the equity priorities are different, diverse in each context. However, and of course there's different priorities in terms of educators. Some educators don't see gender equity as an issue, obviously, so they're not going to focus on it. So there's a huge problematic here and underlying things that I'm not dealing with in this presentation. But I do think that a focus on redistribution, recognition and representation, and of course the complexities that those three dimensions throw up that I've just scratched the surface of today, is an imperative for dismantling barriers to participatory parity. Thank you very much.